In this lecture, you will learn about the series of actions and reactions between the British and Americans that leads to the American Revolution. By the end of this video, you will be able to describe laws like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, Townshend Acts, Tea Act, and Coercive Acts, and describe American responses to those laws, like written protests, boycotts, Committees of Correspondence, Sons of Liberty, Stamp Act Congress, First Continental Congress, and the Boston Tea Party. What you're going to see with this lecture is a chain of events, a series of actions and reactions on the part of the British and the Americans that leads our country into a war of independence. Remember in the last lecture how we learned that Britain was going to need some taxes to make up for all the money that they borrowed to fight the French? Well, the first of those taxes to hit the colonies was the Sugar Act. So what was the Sugar Act and how did the Americans react to the tax? The Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered the existing tax on molasses, which is made from sugar. You might be wondering what molasses is or why a tax on it is even that important. Well, molasses is used to make rum, and rum was big business in the New England colonies. That is the kind of thing they don't like to put in textbooks. New England was probably the leading rum exporter in the world at that time. Remember those triangle trade routes that we discussed during colonization? Well, rum was a big part of that. Slaves were shipped from Africa to sugar plantations in the West Indies, where they toiled the brief remainder of their very unpleasant lives. The sugar they produced went to New England, where it was made into rum. That rum was then sent off to other colonies, or Europe, or Africa for consumption. As I said, the tax was lowered, but the enforcement of the tax increased to prevent smuggling. The net result is the colonists would end up paying more tax. This enforcement included the confiscation of any suspected contraband or illegal sugar or molasses, often before any trial was held to determine guilt. Many colonists, like Boston lawyer James Otis, argued that Parliament in Britain did not have the right to tax the colonists because the colonists had no representatives there in Parliament. This is the birth of the Patriot slogan, "No taxation without representation." The British followed this tax up with one the Americans considered even more invasive, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 placed the tax on virtually all printed paper. This included legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The Brits thought this was a small and innocuous tax, and did not understand that it would carry great symbolism for the Americans. In the colonial mind, this might put every paper transaction, even the exchange of written information, or even religious texts, under Britain's control. This tax went over like a fart in church. The Americans were not going to take this sitting down. Their responses were both varied and effective. An organization called the Sons of Liberty began to form, with the most active one in Boston. It was led by James Otis and Samuel Adams. It is Samuel Adams who is really the emotional and radical point man for their operations in Boston. The Sons of Liberty engaged in large-scale protests. They threatened tax collectors by burning effigies that resembled the tax collectors. An effigy is a roughly made model of a person. Imagine an angry mob outside your home, screaming in anger, burning a figure that represented you. It's a scary proposition. Sometimes the Sons attacked the tax collectors, tarring and feathering them. They would strip the person naked, hold them down, pour hot tar all over them, and then roll them in feathers. Tar was plentiful in Boston because it was used to seal ships and prevent wood from rotting. This practice was both painful and humiliating for the victim. Sometimes the Sons would burn the homes or offices of officials to chase them out of town. The tax collectors and customs officials were not particularly well paid, and most of them quickly wanted nothing to do with their jobs. There was also an organization called the Daughters of Liberty. This was one of the first attempts by women in America to organize politically. They encouraged and aided in the production of goods at home to reduce the dependency on British imports. But that wasn't all. Americans boycotted British goods, which hurt merchants in London that were getting rich off the trade with America. After all, the earlier navigation acts gave them what they thought was exclusive access to American markets. With their business suffering, these British merchants exercised considerable political muscle to pressure Parliament to end the Stamp Act. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, a radical firebrand named Patrick Henry argued convincingly that colonists needed to stand up for their rights. When another member yelled out treason during one of his speeches, Henry replied, "If this be treason, make the most of it," the implication being that if they were going to resist, why not go all the way and rebel against the king? Henry was not one to shy away from strong words. Delegates from 9 of the colonies met at what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They drafted and sent a petition to the king entitled Declaration of Rights and Grievances, that argued that taxation without representation violated their natural and political rights. Benjamin Franklin was in London at the time, acting as an agent for the colony of Pennsylvania. Franklin, a wealthy printer and inventor, known for his wit and wisdom, was probably the most famous American in the world at the time. He warned Parliament that should they use troops to enforce the Stamp Act in America, it could lead to open rebellion. This was a global game of chicken, and the British were the ones who... So, were the American protests successful? They were successful to a large extent. In March of 1766, Britain repealed the Stamp Act before it had ever actually been enforced. British merchants, hurting the boycotts, had urged Parliament to end the tax. But Parliament did not cave in completely. On the same day, they passed the Declaratory Act. It stated that Parliament had the power to pass any taxes it wished. It was a warning to the Americans that any further taxation temper tantrums would not be tolerated. The Americans learned an important lesson that would drive their actions for the next decade. They learned that if they were unified in their action and caused a big enough disruption, they would get results. This emboldened them to even greater resistance. The new leader in Britain, Charles Townshend, passed a new set of taxes in 1767. The Townshend Act placed taxes on lots of imported items like paper, glass, tea, and paint. More colonial protests resulted. The royal governor of Massachusetts asked for troops to keep the peace and to enforce the new laws. In 1770, a new prime minister takes charge in Britain named Lord North. He repealed most of the taxes in 1770. That should calm things down, right? No, because he sent about 1,000 troops to Boston to meet the governor's request. The citizens of Boston viewed these troops as an occupying enemy army. They thought of themselves as British citizens, and the presence of the troops was particularly offensive. The city was ready to explode because of the tension between the civilians and the soldiers. This brings us to the Boston Massacre of 1770. On a cold, snowy night, a group of 7 British soldiers were guarding a customs house, which was an office for tax collectors. A mob of civilians showed up, probably many of which were members of the Sons of Liberty. They shouted insults at the soldiers and threw snowballs and oyster shells at them. At some point, the frightened soldiers fired, and 5 civilians were killed. The first victim was a black man named Crispus Attucks. Attucks was an escaped slave of half African and half Indian ancestry who worked as a sailor in Boston. Many consider him to be the first casualty lost in America's war for independence. I've always found it ironic that he was a member of 2 racial groups that have been the most discriminated against in our nation's history. As things start to escalate, communication across the colonies of British actions becomes extremely important. Committees of Correspondence formed across the colonies to send letters informing of British actions during the late 1760s and 1770s. It became a widespread communication network that later developed into a sort of underground or shadow colonial government because the British were chipping away at the power of local colonial legislatures. The soldiers involved in the massacre were put on trial in a colonial court. The prevailing belief was that an all-American jury would probably quickly convict them and probably hand them over to the Sons of Liberty for public execution. Sam Adams led protests advocating for mob justice. He also gets the governor to agree to remove the soldiers from Boston to prevent further violence. John Adams, who would later become the second president of the United States, was a prominent Boston lawyer and cousin of Sam Adams. While he agreed in principle with many of Sam's ideas, he believed that the rule of law should be maintained and the soldiers should get a fair trial. He successfully defended them in court amidst a hostile audience that included his cousin. In the end, 5 of the soldiers were acquitted and found not guilty. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, or accidental death, and were branded. They were burned on their hands and released. So let's talk about tea in colonial America. The water back then was very dangerous to drink. It was full of bacteria, diseases, and pollutants. It was usually only safe to drink if one of 2 things was done. 1, it could be turned into an alcoholic beverage like rum. The alcohol would kill whatever cooties happened to be inside the water. That was why it was so common to drink alcohol back then, and why rum was such a big business for Boston. The second option was to boil the water and use the tea to improve the flavor. If you were not drinking alcohol, this was about your only other option in colonial America, which brings us to the Tea Act. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. It gave one company, the British East India Company, a monopoly on the tea trade to America. A monopoly is when one company controls all the business and there is no price competition. The law also increased enforcement to prevent smuggling of other types of tea. All this hurt American merchants, many of which were members of the Sons of Liberty. When the ships with the East Indian Company tea arrived, the Bostonians refused to unload them, and the ships just sat in the harbor loaded with tea. One night the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans and snuck aboard the ships. A silly disguise, really. Everyone knew who they were, and natives had all been but exterminated in New England decades earlier. They were able to sneak aboard the ships, though, because Samuel Adams had talked the governor into removing the troops. Once aboard, they destroyed 342 chests of tea in what quickly became known as the Boston Tea Party. Boston was not an isolated incident either. Similar protests took place in other American port cities. A capable and flexible leader probably could have brought this conflict back from the brink of disaster. George III was not that leader. He was completely unsuited to the situation. He was domineering and rash when the problem called for flexibility and patience. In addition, he was mentally unstable and prone to bouts of insanity that only increased in frequency and duration as he got older. All he cared about was that his authority to enforce the law was being challenged. He wanted the colonies to recognize that he was their master. He wanted Boston punished and brought to heel, like a dog on a leash. To punish Boston, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in 1774. The word coerce means to persuade an unwilling person to do something by threat or force. This collection of laws was considered so oppressive and ruthless in the colonies that they nicknamed them the Intolerable Acts. The result of the laws were numerous. Boston was closed, shutting off the trade that was the lifeblood of the city. Town meetings, the basis for colonial government, were banned. Massachusetts' colonial charter was revoked, which ended the colonial legislature. A military government was put in its place under the leadership of General Thomas Gage. This put Boston under martial or military law. A new and more extensive quartering act allowed for the placement of soldiers in homes and businesses. The Quebec Act confiscated a large tract of land that was part of the colony and owned by the Americans and made it part of Canada. It is easy to see how these acts were both coercive and intolerable. Not surprising to anyone other than George III, these laws had the exact opposite effect of what he intended. They unified the colonies in resistance. Delegates from every colony except Georgia met in Philadelphia to agree to demands and plan a unified response to the British. So what was the result of this historic meeting? First, the delegates adopted a declaration written by John Adams that demanded recognition of their natural rights to life, liberty, and property. It denounced the actions of Parliament as unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive. It demanded a repeal of not just the coercive acts, but all taxes on the colonies. The delegates agreed to an economic boycott that would be enforced by the local Committees of Correspondence. This meant no trade at all with Britain. Economic warfare had been successful for them before, and they intended to use it again on a massive scale. Finally, they agreed to meet again in a few months. In May of 1775, they would give the British time to respond, given the long travel times across the ocean. Then they could plan their next move, hopefully after the British gave in to their demands. They would find that they had greatly misjudged the benevolence of their king.